Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome back. If you're new here, I do these true story videos pretty regularly, and tonight we're going deep into something that genuinely makes my skin crawl every time I think about it. Security guards, night shift, the people who are hired specifically to watch over places in the dark when everyone else has gone home, when the lights are mostly off, when the building belongs to shadows and silence. You'd think the job would be straightforward. Walk the perimeter, check the cameras, make sure nothing moves that isn't supposed to. But the men and women who've actually worked those shifts know something that most of us will never understand. Sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what you catch on camera. Sometimes, it's what the camera can't explain. Tonight, we're going through 5 true accounts shared by real security guards on forums, Reddit threads, and anonymous storyboards across the internet. These are not urban legends. These are not campfire tales. These are first-hand experiences from people who were paid to be in those dark buildings, alone, at 2 in the morning, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a radio that didn't always get a signal. So, sit back, get comfortable, maybe leave a light on, and let's get into it. Before we do, if you enjoy these videos, please like and subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel more than you know. And if you make it to the end of tonight's video, drop a comment and tell me which story scared you the most. All right, let's go. Story number 1. This one was posted on a security guard forum called Watchmen Speak, and the user went by the name Night Patrol Gerald. The title of his post was, "I don't work that building anymore, and I never will again." Gerald had been working private security for about 11 years at the time of this story. He described himself as someone who had seen everything: drunk trespassers, teenagers breaking in to smoke weed, once even a guy who had been living in the walls of a mall for 3 weeks. He was not a man who scared easily. He was the kind of guy who laughed at ghost stories and told his co-workers to grow up whenever anyone complained about strange sounds on a shift. His assignment in this particular story was an old textile mill in the Pacific Northwest that had been purchased by a development company. The company was planning to convert it into loft apartments, but the permits were taking forever, so the building just sat there, empty. 6 floors of crumbling brick, broken windows patched with plastic sheeting, and machinery that no one had bothered to remove yet. Enormous industrial looms, rusted spindles, old equipment that cast strange shapes in the dark. The development company contracted Gerald's security firm to post 1 guard on the premises overnight, 6 days a week, to deter vandals and keep the property insured. Gerald pulled the assignment for 4 months before anything happened. He wrote, "I had a routine. Come in at 10 p.m., sign the logbook at the front desk, which was just a folding table we'd set up in the lobby. Do a sweep of the ground floor. Check that the emergency exits were locked from outside. Then go up to the 2nd floor and do a sweep there. Then back down to the desk to watch a movie on my laptop until about 1 a.m. Then do another full sweep and then settle in until 6 when the morning guy came in." I knew every inch of that building. I knew which floorboards creaked. I knew which windows let in wind and rattled in their frames. I knew where the rats liked to nest. I was never scared, not once, until the night of November 14th. He remembered the date specifically because it was the night after his birthday. He'd gone out with friends, hadn't slept much, and was running on 2 cups of gas station coffee when he arrived at the mill at 10 p.m. He noticed immediately that something felt different, though he couldn't say what. He described it as the air pressure feeling wrong, like the building was holding its breath. He did his ground floor sweep, checked the exits, and was heading to the staircase when he heard it. A sound coming from the 4th floor. Not a creak, not a rattle. A sound he described as rhythmic tapping, like someone dragging their fingernails slowly across a wooden surface. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. He wrote, "My first thought was animal, raccoon, maybe a large bird that had gotten in through one of the broken windows. I wasn't scared, I was annoyed. Last thing I wanted to do at 10:30 p.m. on 4 hours of sleep was climb 4 flights of stairs to chase a raccoon. But I had to check. That was the job." He took his flashlight and his radio and went up. The 3rd floor was clear. He got to the 4th floor landing and pushed open the heavy door, and the tapping stopped. Absolute silence. He did a full sweep of the 4th floor. It was mostly open space, old looms arranged in rows, and found nothing. No animal, no person, no obvious source for the sound. He went back downstairs. Within 10 minutes, the tapping started again. He did this 3 times. Every time he went to the 4th floor, it stopped. Every time he came back down, it started again. On the 4th trip, he decided to move quietly. He took off his boots, held the stairwell door open slowly so it wouldn't creak, and crept across the 4th floor in his socks. The tapping was coming from the far end of the room, near a row of old machinery. He moved toward it with his flashlight off, using only the ambient glow from outside through the plastic-covered windows. He got to within 20 feet of the source when his flashlight, which he was holding but had not turned on, switched on by itself. He wrote, "I know how that sounds. I know. But I am telling you, my hand was not on the switch. The switch was in the off position. The light just came on, and in the beam of that light, I saw something that I have never been able to fully explain." Standing between 2 of the old looms was a figure, not an animal, a person, or something shaped like a person. Gerald described it as very tall and very thin, with limbs that seemed slightly too long. It was facing away from him. It was completely still. And then, he wrote, it turned its head, not its body, just its head, slowly, all the way around until it was looking directly at him over its own shoulder. Gerald ran. He didn't stop at the lobby. He went straight out the front door, got in his car, and drove away. He called his supervisor from the parking lot of a gas station a mile away and quit on the spot. He said he would forfeit his last paycheck if they needed him to. But he was never going back into that building. His supervisor was furious. But 2 nights later, the replacement guard, a guy named Torres, also quit. He wouldn't say why. He told the firm he had a family emergency. But Gerald later ran into Torres at a mutual friend's barbecue and asked him what had happened. Torres said, "I don't talk about that place." And that was all he would say. The development company eventually sold the building. Gerald looked it up years later and found that the loft conversion project had been abandoned entirely. The mill was condemned and demolished in 2019. He said he still doesn't know what he saw, but he knows what his gut told him in that moment when the figure turned its head. Whatever it was, it had been there a very long time, and it did not appreciate being found. Story number 2 comes from Reddit's RR True Off My Chest and was posted by a user called Throwaway Secguard City 9. The title was, "Something has been mimicking my coworker's voice, and I'm starting to think it isn't a prank." The poster, "Let's call him Ryan," which is the name he used in some of his replies, worked security at a large indoor shopping mall in the Midwest. The mall had been struggling financially for years, and large portions of it had been closed off as anchor stores shut down. This left vast stretches of the building completely dark and empty behind locked accordion gates, accessible only to maintenance and security staff. Ryan had worked there for about 2 years, always on the overnight shift, partnered with another guard named Phil. Ryan described Phil as his best friend at work, a big guy, loud, always cracking jokes, always trying to scare Ryan in the empty sections of the mall by jumping out from behind pillars. Ryan said Phil had pulled so many pranks on him that Ryan had developed a kind of sixth sense for when Phil was about to try something. He knew his coworker's footsteps, his laugh, even the specific way Phil cleared his throat before he said something. About 6 months before Ryan posted the story, something changed. Ryan wrote, "It started small. I'd hear Phil's voice coming from the closed-off East Wing, the old department store section that's been locked up for like 4 years. I'd hear him calling my name, or sometimes just humming this dumb song he always hummed. And I'd go over there thinking he was goofing around, and he wouldn't be there. I'd call his radio, and he'd answer from the complete opposite end of the mall. I figured my ears were playing tricks. Or maybe I was just tired. But it kept happening, and it started getting more specific. The voice wasn't just calling his name or humming. It started saying things that Phil would say. Inside jokes, references to conversations they'd had. Once, Ryan heard the voice say from somewhere in the dark East Wing, "Hey, remember what you said about your ex? You were right, man. You were totally right." Ryan had told Phil about his breakup in a private conversation a week earlier. He hadn't told anyone else at work. He went to Phil immediately and asked him if he'd been in the East Wing. Phil said no. He hadn't been anywhere near there in months. The gate lock was always stiff, and he'd stopped bothering with it. Ryan asked Phil if he'd told anyone about the breakup story. Phil said absolutely not. He'd kept it to himself. Ryan wrote, "I started to really freak out at that point, because the voice knew things it shouldn't have known, and it sounded exactly like Phil. Not kind of like Phil, exactly like him. The cadence, the accent, everything. If I hadn't known where Phil actually was, I would have bet my life it was him." Things escalated 2 weeks later. Ryan was doing a solo check of the food court. Phil had stepped out to meet a delivery at the loading dock when he heard Phil's voice, clear as anything, coming from inside the permanently closed burger restaurant near the south entrance. The restaurant had been shuttered for 3 years. The interior was pitch black. The voice said, "Ryan, come in here, man. You gotta see this. This is crazy." Ryan stood at the locked gate of the restaurant and shone his flashlight through. He couldn't see anyone inside. He said, "Phil, you in there?" And the voice said, Yeah, come on. You're not gonna believe this." Ryan tried the gate. Locked. He said, "Phil, the gate's locked. I can't get in." And there was a pause, a long one. And then the voice said, in a tone Ryan described as suddenly different, lower, slower, almost like a recording that had been slowed down, "That's okay, I can come to you." Ryan ran to the security office and locked the door. He called Phil on the radio. Phil was still at the loading dock, hadn't come back yet. and said he had no idea what Ryan was talking about. Mall management brought in a pest control company the following week, citing a possible issue with displaced animals. Sometimes raccoons or foxes could find their way into closed sections of a building, and their vocalizations could, in certain acoustic conditions, sound startlingly human. The pest control team found nothing in the East Wing or in the burger restaurant. No animals, no evidence of entry. Ryan transferred to a different location 2 months later. He wrote, "I know I don't have an explanation. I know it sounds insane, but I need people to understand. Whatever was in that mall knew things about me, things it shouldn't have known, and it could make itself sound exactly like someone I trusted. That's not a raccoon. I don't know what that is, but I'm glad I never found out." Story number 3 is one that's been circulating in security guard communities for years, and it's one I keep coming back to because of the detail and the sheer specificity of it. The original post appeared on a now-defunct security professional forum, and the author identified himself only as DM, 19 years in private security, Pacific Coast Division. I'll call him Dennis. Dennis was assigned to a large corporate office park, a campus-style complex with 6 buildings, an underground parking structure, a central courtyard, and about 4 miles of internal hallways connecting everything. The complex was active during business hours, but completely empty at night. His job was to do hourly patrols and monitor the camera system from a central security desk. He worked that campus for 6 years without anything unusual happening. Then, in the winter, he didn't specify the year, he started noticing something on the cameras. Building 3 of the complex had a long interior hallway on the 2nd floor, about 200 feet long, lined on both sides with glass-walled offices. The cameras in that hallway were positioned so that you could see the full length of the corridor on the monitor. Dennis noticed over the course of about 2 weeks that something was appearing in that hallway on camera between the hours of 3 and 4 in the morning. He described it initially as a smudge, like a lens flare or moisture on the camera housing, except that it moved slowly. It would appear at one end of the hallway and travel to the other over the course of about 40 minutes. It was not consistent from night to night. Sometimes it was slightly different in shape. Sometimes it moved faster. Sometimes it stopped for extended periods. But it was always in hallway 2, always between 3 and 4 a.m., always moving from east to west. Dennis wrote, "I logged it every night for 11 nights. I called building maintenance. They checked the camera, found nothing wrong with it. I called the camera service company. Their technician came out, reviewed the footage, and told me there was no mechanical explanation. The lens was clean. The housing was intact. The camera was functioning normally." He watched the footage of the smudge moving down the hallway, and he went quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I've seen things like this once or twice before. I'd recommend not going to that hallway between 3 and 4. And then he packed up his tools and left. On the 12th night, Dennis decided to go check it in person. He arrived at the entrance to hallway 2 in building 3 at 3:05 a.m. and stood at the end of the corridor with his flashlight. The hallway was empty. He could see the full length of it under the fluorescent emergency lights that stayed on overnight. Nothing there. He walked in about 30 feet and stopped. And that's when he felt it. He described it as a sudden and overwhelming sense of wrongness, not quite cold, not quite pressure, but something that his body registered as profoundly dangerous. He said every hair on his body stood up simultaneously, and he experienced what he could only describe as an animal certainty that he was not alone in that hallway. He turned and walked quickly back to the entrance. He did not run because he was afraid that running would trigger whatever was there to pursue him. He said this instinct came from somewhere he couldn't rationally explain. He just knew in his bones that he should not run. He reviewed the footage from that night the following morning. The smudge was on camera, visible and moving. And in the same footage, you could see Dennis entering the hallway, stopping and walking back out. The smudge stopped moving the moment Dennis entered. It remained still until he left. Then it continued on its slow journey to the west end of the corridor. Dennis submitted a full incident report to his company. The report was reviewed by management, who told him the footage was likely a camera artifact and that he should disregard it. He continued to log the appearances for another 3 weeks. Then they stopped. He never saw the smudge again after that. He never had an explanation for what it was. He wrote, "I have been doing this job for a long time. I have a rational mind. I do not believe in ghosts, but I do believe in things I cannot explain. And whatever walked that hallway between 3 and 4 in the morning for 33 consecutive nights, it was something. I just don't know what." Story number 4. This one is harder to read because it's not just scary, it's deeply unsettling in a very human way. It was posted by a woman, she gave her name as Carla, on a true story subreddit about 2 years ago. Carla had worked security at a large children's hospital for 3 years. She loved the job, she said. She liked feeling like she was protecting something that mattered. She worked the overnight shift in the east wing of the hospital, which included the pediatric oncology ward. She wrote, "I want to be clear before I tell this story that I have enormous respect for the families who go through what they go through in that ward. This is a sacred space, and I take what happened there with complete seriousness. I'm not sharing this to be sensational. I'm sharing it because it changed how I understand the world." One night, Carla was doing her hourly patrol of the 3rd floor, the oncology ward, around 2 in the morning. The floor was quiet. Most of the children were asleep. The nursing station was staffed but calm. Carla walked the corridor, checked the stairwells, and was heading back to the elevator when she noticed that the door to room 3117 was open. It should have been closed. The child in that room, a boy, she said, she won't give any identifying details, was in critical condition and required a controlled environment. She went to close the door and looked in as she did. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the monitoring equipment. The boy was in the bed, seemingly asleep. And sitting in the chair beside his bed was a woman, an older woman, white-haired, wearing what Carla described as old-fashioned clothing, a dark dress, very simple, with a brooch at the collar. The woman was looking at the boy, not touching him, not speaking, just looking. Carla said, "I assumed it was a grandmother staying overnight. We allowed that in certain circumstances, but something felt off to me about her. I couldn't say what exactly. She was just very, very still." Carla knocked softly on the open door and said, "Excuse me, ma'am. Visiting hours for this floor end at 11. I'm going to have to ask you to come back in the morning." The woman didn't respond. didn't look up. Carla stepped into the room and said it again, a little louder. The woman still didn't respond. Carla approached the chair. She put her hand on the woman's shoulder. There was no one there. Her hand passed through the space where the woman had been sitting and touched only the back of the chair. She stumbled back, knocking against the monitoring equipment, which beeped. The night nurse came running. Carla was standing in the middle of the room alone, staring at an empty chair. She told the nurse what she had seen. The nurse went pale. She pulled Carla outside the room and told her, quietly, so as not to disturb the other patients, that this was not the first time. That several nurses on the overnight shift had reported seeing an older woman in dark clothing in the rooms of children who were in critical condition. That it had been reported going back years, and that every time it was seen, the child in the room passed away within the following 48 hours. Carla wrote, "The boy in room 317 died the next evening at 7 p.m. I attended a small memorial the hospital organized for staff. I lit a candle. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know who or what that woman was, but I know she wasn't there for any reason I could explain in a report. And I know she was with him in those last hours. I have to believe there was some kind of mercy in that. I have to." She left the job 4 months later, not because of fear, she said, but because she needed to go somewhere the grief didn't follow her home every morning. Story number 5, the last one, and this is the one that keeps me up at night. This was posted anonymously on a security professional message board. No name, no location, no identifying details, just the account. The poster described working overnight security at a large self-storage facility, one of those massive complexes with dozens of buildings, hundreds of individual units, wide industrial lanes between the structures. The kind of place that, at 2 in the morning, feels like being inside an enormous maze. He had worked there for 8 months when it started. He was the only guard on the property from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The facility had a camera system, but no live monitoring. He checked the feeds periodically from the main office, but was mostly on foot patrol. One night, he received an alert on the property system. A motion sensor had triggered in Building 7, Section D. He went to investigate. Building 7 was at the far end of the property, about a 6-minute walk. He got there, checked the units in Section D, found nothing out of the ordinary. He assumed an animal had triggered the sensor. The facility had a problem with strays, and logged it and moved on. This happened 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Always Building 7, always Section D, always nothing found on inspection. On the 5th trigger, he decided to pull the camera footage to see what had activated the sensor. He wrote, "I pulled up the footage and I watched it for a long time before I understood what I was seeing. The motion sensor had triggered. You could see the timestamp, but nothing had moved in the frame. Nothing at all. The lane was empty. The units were closed. And then I looked at the unit directly below the sensor, Unit 7D14, and I saw that the latch was slightly different than in the previous footage, like the door had been opened and closed again between the last time I'd checked and when the sensor triggered." He checked the rental records for Unit 7D14. It was registered to a man who had been renting it for about 2 years. He paid automatically, never came in during business hours, never had any complaints or issues. an entirely unremarkable account. The guard wrote, "I don't know what made me do this. I don't know why I didn't just log it and move on. But I went back to Building 7 and I stood in front of Unit 7D14 and I knocked on the door, like you'd knock on a door. And I said, 'Sir, this is security. Is everything okay in there?' There was silence. And then, from inside the unit, a voice said, 'Yes, fine, thank you.' He said the voice was calm, conversational, like someone sitting in their living room being briefly interrupted. He called his supervisor immediately. Local police were dispatched. When they opened Unit 7D14, they found that someone had been living there, not for a night or two, for what investigators estimated was close to 7 months. There was a mattress, a battery-powered lamp, a camp stove, a cooler, containers of food and water, and an extensive collection of photographs. The photographs covered an entire wall of the storage unit. They were surveillance photos, hundreds of them. Pictures of people, men, women, and children going about their daily lives at grocery stores, at parks, at school pickup, coming out of their homes. Faces the investigators didn't initially recognize. The man who rented the unit was identified and arrested. He had been living there for 7 months, leaving during the day and returning at night, slipping past the guard change at shift transitions. The photographs were of people he had been fixating on. Several of them were families from a neighborhood about 2 miles from the facility. The guard wrote, "I think about what would have happened if I hadn't knocked on that door. I think about the fact that he had been there for 7 months and no one had known. I think about those photos and those families who had no idea. And I think about the fact that every time the motion sensor triggered in those weeks before I pulled the footage, he was coming and going at night. He was right there, a few feet from me, in the dark. And I walked right past him every time." The man was prosecuted and convicted. The families in the photographs were notified. The guard quit 2 weeks after the arrest. He wrote in his final comment on the post, "I don't regret knocking on that door, but I do think about it every day, about what was on the other side, about how close it was, about how long it had been there in the dark, watching and waiting, and no one knew." All right, that's 5 stories, 5 nights, 5 guards who went to work expecting nothing and came home with something they'll carry for the rest of their lives. I think about these stories a lot, honestly. Not just as scary content, but as a reminder that there are people out there doing unglamorous, often overlooked work in the dark, keeping watch so that the rest of us can sleep. And sometimes, what they find in the dark is something that doesn't have a clean explanation. If you enjoyed this video, or if it completely destroyed your ability to sleep tonight, which, fair, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know which story got to you the most. I read all of them. Thank you so much for watching. Take care of yourselves out there, and maybe double check your storage unit.